So good morning everyone, my name is Roy Wetherall, one of the founding engineers, and my current responsibility is for the records management module. This morning we're going to have a look at, it's basically a quick start on how to get started with customizing records management. This is based on 2.2, well actually, tell a lie, it's based on 2.3a, which is the community release. And it's going to be fairly quick, it's relatively technical. What I'm going to do is we have all the examples you see today are all in the Maven SDK, so all the detailed code is there and it all executes and runs. And I'm basically going to take you through some of the techniques at quite a high level and just kind of take you through the steps that you need to go through. So that gives you kind of an entry point. So when you actually start to look at the code, you'll be a bit more familiar with what we've got to do. So here's the rough agenda. First off, we're going to have a quick look at the Maven SDK. How many people here are familiar with the Maven SDK? Hopefully a few of you. Good, that's excellent. And then we're going to do three very simple things. First off, we're going to build a sort of custom file plan type around a compliance example. Then we're going to add some custom record metadata, and then finally we're going to add some behavior so that that record metadata is a bit smarter. And hopefully we'll have some time for questions. So first off, we're going to have a quick look at the Maven SDK. One of the things that we've done to try and enable you guys to start customizing RM is actually integrate RM into the SDK. And this was done relatively recently. I believe if you take the latest version 2, all of the things that I'm talking about will be available to you. We use the Maven SDK all-in-one archetype. So if you create that all-in-one archetype project, it will be exactly as you expect, but now you'll have the additional RM dependencies that you need to actually kind of, use. So the other thing that the other piece that we're going to have a look at in a minute is that we also will retrieve the relevant RM amps for you and apply them during your build process. So that means if you're building custom RM code, you can use the Maven SDK to pull the walls down, apply the RM amps, and then apply your customization. Okay, so you basically don't have to do very much at all, is the idea. We're talking again the V2 SDK and a 2.3a default RM dependency. Okay, so we haven't yet released a 2.3b. We do tend to lag behind the main product, obviously, because much like many of you guys, we are a dependent customization. So but look out for that. Hopefully we'll see a 2.3b fairly soon. So this is going to run in the background while I'm kind of chatting, and this is really to give you an idea of how simple it is. What I'm going to do here is just generate a new project, and this is just using the generate method pointing to the standard all-in-one archetype. So we do the usual stuff that you'd expect. You pop in your group ID and your project name, and that's going to run exactly like it would run normally. I'm sure a lot of you have seen this many times before, and will probably used it. And you can see, there we go, we've got all the dependencies and stuff. So that's gone away. Obviously I cheated, I'd already downloaded my Maven dependencies. But you can see we've got our Alfresco RM custom project, and there's all the bits and pieces that we'd expect inside it. Okay, so there's nothing new here. And this is a theme that you'll see often in this presentation. There's nothing new here. Okay, it's just all the same again. So we're going to run our integration test, and let me see if I can be clever and pause this, maybe. Now the only bit that you really need to know is, and it's very small so I apologise for that, but we'll summarise it later, is we're doing a Maven clean integration test there. Normally you do that /p run, and that will build everything, apply your custom amps to your war, and start up your in-memory bits and pieces. There's an additional RM option here, and that's the piece that will grab the RM amps and apply them before your customization. Okay, so and that's really all you need to do that's different from your normal kind of usage of the SDK. Obviously we're not going to watch it do all that because that takes a little while, but once you've done that and it's run up, you've got your in-memory, you've got your application server. We can hit localhost 8080, and this is just to show that RM will be installed. There we go, we've got our records management site that we can create. Okay, So again, what we try to do in records management is we use all the same tools that you guys use. so we're the sort of first internal customer, if you like, and we're also using the same development environment as well. Okay, so you'll see nothing particularly new. Same process again. If you want to use Eclipse, you can go in, you can import your Maven projects, import the POMs directly if you've got the M2E plugin installed, and in a minute you'll see the standard package structure, and you can go start adding some RM customizations. Okay, so again we use Spring, share customizations, all the stuff you'd expect, with just a few extra services and a few extra bells and whistles, and some of those things we're going to see today. Okay, so there's my repo amp, there's my share amp, and I can start customizing away. So just to summarize, we use the Maven archetype, generate the projects. We can use that additional RM option to apply the RM amps and then apply our customization. We can go browse to localhost, and we'll see RM installed plus our customization, and then we can import the POMs into Eclipse or wherever to actually do stuff. Okay, so that's the mechanics of it, and hopefully that means you guys can all kind of get off the ground pretty quickly. What we're going to do now is just look at creating a custom file plan. Obviously records management is an area that really we try and provide as much out of the box as we can, but ultimately every organization has a different need, and quite often different geographies have different needs. As you're probably all well aware, there's a dozen different standards, so being able to actually customize to your specific compliance needs is quite important. So what we're going to do in this section is actually add a custom records management site type that we can actually create from that create dialog box. Those of you that have seen 2.2 will have seen that we've actually now separated out the notion of different compliances. So when you create your records management site, you can create a standard site which is just vanilla and almost has no metadata attached to the records, which is great for some people. And then you can create a DoD compliant site which has all the old bells and whistles that many people didn't want. So what we're going to do is add our own one of those essentially, and relate that site to a custom file plan type, which we can then start to hang our metadata and stuff off. So generally speaking, we're going to look at, there are two sides to these customizations. There's the customization of the repository and the services, and there's the customization of the user interface or share. So we're going to kind of look at these in two different steps as we go. So first off, we're going to have a look at what we need to do to the repository side. How many people here are familiar with the way we do content modeling in Alfresco? Okay, that's good. I don't need to dwell too much on this, because this is very standard stuff. Okay, what we're trying to do here is introduce two new types to a custom model. One is our custom RM site type, and one is our custom file plan type. Now there tends to be a one-to-one relationship between the two. We use the site as a kind of convenient container for our file plan to live in, and then the file plan type itself is actually our filing cabinet, okay, which will be contained within that site. And we'll see how we can relate the two in a minute. But for now, all we need to do is actually drop off our records management model. We have, much like there's a standard content model, there is an additional records management model you can import and use. And you'll find in there's a standard RM site and a standard RM file plan. So nothing too exciting there, I'm afraid. We're just going to create those two types. And for those of you that aren't familiar with this, again, this is kind of standard mechanics. In our amp, we'll obviously have our module context where we're able to bring in our additional beans. And instead of just dumping that model in the extensions directory, which is potentially a bit risky because obviously you may have multiple other amps all kind of extending and overlaying, we can use this dictionary model bootstrap, which is part of the core, to specifically find a model and bootstrap it into the data dictionary. Okay, so as we know, this module context will be run when our amp is installed and run up at start time. Okay, so that's how we load in that additional model. And just for completeness, I've also got an associated message bundle which will allow me to internationalize that model should we actually display any of those items in the UI, which we likely will later on. Now finally, this is the RM bit, and this is how we relate that file plan type to the site type. So this describes how, when we create this particular type of RM site, which file plan type we're going to create within it. Okay, generally speaking, you're probably going to have a one-to-one relationship, but it's also possible to kind of mix and match. Okay, and we use this again. We could just, because we've got the RM dependencies, we can just pull in this RM site type bootstrap sort of base bean, and this is all the work that we need to do. Okay, so in actual fact, this is really the only RM specific bit of customization we're doing here. The rest again is just standard techniques. Okay, so that's given us our custom types. We've registered them together, so the RM services understand that they're there and can be used. Now we have to do one last thing. We have to kind of make sure that that a new site type appears in our create site dialog. I'm sure we could improve this. We could probably pick that up automatically, but at the moment we have to do a small amount of customization. So this is in our share ramp. And again, I'm going to cover a few things that are not really RM specific, but just to give you context, so you know everything that you'd have to do. This is in my my custom extensions file. Now I'm not super familiar with some of this, so I'm repeating some of this verbatim. So excuse me if I'm talking to the converted. But essentially, what we're doing here is actually just registering this share module. And the reason we do that is because we only want these share customizations to kick in when we're in an RM site dashboard. Okay, so there's our evaluator that tells us only really worry about this if I'm in an RM site. And then lastly down here, these are some the customization directories that allow us to pick up additional JavaScript that we can apply to the core dialogues. Okay, now what that means we can then do is we can, in our RM customization, we can add a create site.get.js, which effectively overlays the core one, but gets run in addition because of that module customization we've done. Because what we really want to do is grab this compliance list or map and just add our site type and a message. Okay. So that's just going to add that entry. You'll see in a minute. You'll add this, adds an entry to the drop down, and as that kind of gets passed all the way back to the other side, the RM services know then which RM site type to create. Okay. So again, this is an RM customization piece. I've done a few again just for completeness. We'll have a properties file on that side of the fence for that display label, and we can register that bundle using the standard mechanisms, using the resource bundle bootstrap component. Okay, so this is on the share side. Okay, so just to say, so we've done that, we've rerun our integration test stuff. We're going to have a little look and see what's happened. So we can log in, and we're going to drop down and to the create site dialog. I'm going to get ready on the pause button. We're going to choose records management site, and we drop down that compliance list. And there you go. There's my custom compliance alongside DoD 501.2 standard, etc. Okay. So obviously this gives you scope, to do specific customizations for specific needs. But it also means if we, as partners and customers, want to roll out, geography-specific standards. For example, we have a partner in Australia who's VERS compliant. It means that we can kind of add these additional modules and actually build out this compliance list for people to use. So we can go through, we can select our custom compliance, and that will go and create, and then we'll be in our kind of new domain, which actually has nothing new in it yet. Okay, so there you go, there's the file plan. Okay, so that's kind of your starting point, and if you are going to do any kind of customization of RM, I think this is a recommended start point, because it kind of gives you your own kind of custom file plan and compliance type to actually start hanging your bits and pieces off. You can of course go in and customize the core compliance if you like, but obviously it's easier this way to kind of partition your own bits from the rest of the world, like we have with DoD. So we need to now go in and sort of add some value to this, make it do something interesting. So what we want to do is actually add some additional metadata to the records that are going to appear in that custom file plan. Now, and this metadata is only going to appear if you're using this type of file plan. The other ones won't be affected. Now, at the moment, we do still only support one records management site, but obviously you can see our intention is to support multiple sites, and that's when this kind of, these different types of compliance would come in handy. You can almost kind of implement different compliance types, perhaps for different departments that have different needs, and therefore different metadata. So we're going to add the custom metadata, and we're going to see how the records management mechanism services will actually identify this special kind of type, this record metadata, and actually do a lot of the work that we would normally have to do for us. So we're not going to have to build any forms, we're not going to have to modify any of the UI for search like we might have to if we were doing a standard share extension. And we're also going to just show how you can add a small visual indicator to show that this additional metadata is there, just to kind of complete it. So this is a slide to remind me to talk about this briefly. So there's often a bit of a discussion around what's record metadata and what's content metadata. And I think a lot of traditional systems, if you're coming from a background where you've used a records management system before, 9 times out of 10 what happens is you do whatever you do, and your content kind of gets rammed into this system, and then you have to augment it with all this context and information, and that's perceived to be record metadata. Our opinion is that in reality, a piece of content really isn't worth much unless it has the business context, i.e. the metadata attached to it in the first place. So with our sort of in-place mechanism and some of the other things that we're able to do to simplify RM, it means that actually the vast majority of the metadata that you're going to want to attach to your record is actually relates to the content, because it defines the business context, the people that interacted with it, etc. So that means actually when you're looking at extending the record metadata, it's actually quite a small subset, and you need quite a good reason to do that, because it really is about information about specifically it being a record, not necessarily about the content as a whole. So kind of an example of this, and again we're just going to look at how we do this in the server first. An example of this, which kind of comes from a customer that I've spoken to, is that they have an additional compliance ID. They may be ISO compliant, they may be something else compliant. They come from a legacy system and they mark their records in a particular way. So this has got nothing to do with the content. This is specifically about when it becomes a record, we want to mark it in an additional way. So what they want to do is add this My Compliance ID property. Okay, and you can do this very simply. As you can see, I don't know if anybody can spot anything that's RM related there, but frankly there isn't. Okay, so this is a standard aspect in my RM namespace. And we've got one property which is type text, and it's mandatory. Okay, completely standard. We don't need to include any of the RM model at this point. Okay, it's just an additional property. And the way that we kind of make it, if you like, RMy, is that we can register it specifically as a record metadata aspect, and we register it against a specific file plan type or types. Okay, so you can see again we provide these parent kind of beans for your convenience, so you can use this record metadata aspect bootstrap bean and specify all the properties that you want to kind of register. So you can see we're just literally registering that My Compliance record metadata aspect against my RM file plan. Okay, so that's saying whenever I create one of these, this will be available for the users or for the records management team to use. Now that's all we actually have to do. Now I could turn it on and you would actually see all these properties, that property and that aspect available to add to a record and set and search on. But just to make this a bit more interesting, we're going to do a little bit more. We're going to just add a record metadata indicator, so that when you do add that additional aspect, you actually get an all visual icon. And again, this is This really isn't so much about RM, but the reason for including this is to kind of prove the point. I think there's a bit of a, I mean, we haven't had the tools really. This is why we did the SDK integration, is to first off give everybody an easy entry point. And what you should find is you can just reuse all the skills that you've learnt over the last, however many years it's been, 9.5 years, to kind of extend RM in the way you'd expect. So we're going to reuse this has aspect evaluator. You know, we're on the share side, so this is in my share context, and we're just going to say, you know, we've got our compliance record metadata evaluator that says whenever that my record metadata is present, then, you know, throw back a truth. The next thing we need to do, and again this is plumbing just for your information, we need to create a custom share config. And the way that we can do this explicitly, rather than just using the extension mechanism and the naming conventions, is to use that standard config bootstrap bean, and that allows us to register a specific share config in a particular location. Okay, which again is very useful, so you know that you're not going to override anything, and nobody's going to override you. And once we've done that bit of plumbing, it means finally we can. Hopefully, you guys have seen some of this stuff before. We can use the Alfresco sort of XML config notation to extend our document library configuration and add this additional indicator, which is dependent on that evaluator we created. So i.e. when that aspect appears, this indicator will be present in the UI. Okay. And again, finally, for completeness, we just add some more labels to our bundle, so that we're all internationalized and doing, you know, following the best practices for that stuff. So let's have a quick look at what that means. Is it running? Yes, there we go. So what we're in the file plan, we're going to upload a record. Let's grab something, there it goes. Now you can see, I'm just going to pause this. You see the add record metadata. What I've done there is I've clicked on the add record metadata action, and you can see instantly I've got my compliant record type available. Again, no customization required because of that bootstrap, that registration we did. The records management service knows it's something special. Now if you create a vanilla site, you won't see that action because there are no additional metadata aspects out of the box attached to the vanilla site. If however you create the DoD site, you'd see all those aspects that you see against the DoD that traditionally were baked into the core. Okay, so that's part of the reason for doing this, right? Is to be able to separate the different metadata based on the different compliances without them overlapping. So we can select that additional information, so we want to apply it, and there we go. We get our little indicator up here just to show that this thing has this additional information. We're going to drill in and just kind of see. There you go. I've tried to complete it. It won't let me complete it now because that mandatory data isn't there. You can see the compliance ID. Again, it's automatically on the form with the internationalized label that we added earlier on to our model. So there you go. We've added it, and we can go and complete that now because we've got all of our mandatory data. Finally, we can go and have a look, and you see again the read form. Has that property already available to us without any modification, and you'll see that throughout the different aspects of the product. We're going to have a look at search now, but you'll see this in other areas of the product as well. That again, because we know about these things specifically, we can actually make them available to you without any additional work because we understand what they are, right? We know that they're record metadata things, so we can do that that search. We can go and sorry, there's a bit of a lag. I had to turn some stuff off. Where is it? When it comes down, there you go. There's our compliance ID available as a column in our metadata. So there you go. Okay. So again, this is a very specific use case, and there are other ways that you can extend to RM, which would require more work, but this one is probably the most common. If you look at, you know, the DoD, VERS, MOREC, they all have specific sets of metadata that are required or, you know, optional on different types of records. So this kind of smarts makes it easy to add those things in. Okay, so, and that's the objective. So that's all well and good. right? But you don't necessarily want the users to have to apply that aspect every time, and you certainly don't want them necessarily to have to enter that ID in, right? Doesn't make any sense. So what we're going to do in this example is we're actually going to automatically set that compliance ID when that aspect is applied. Now we could obviously automatically apply the aspect, and then that would trigger this behavior that we're going to have a look at, but just for simplicity we're going to just calculate this this ID for them. And to do that we're going to use behaviors. So show of hands, who knows what a behavior is, seen what a policy is in Alfresco? Dave, I know you have. Yeah, thank you. So basically they're like an event, and they and the difference between them and an event is that they additionally relate to a type and an aspect. So that means you can say that on the creation of a CM content, then do this thing, okay? And the things that are fired are filtered by the type or aspect that you're working on. All right. So we talk about and this is the way that you know, sometimes we talk about smart models, and I talk about smart records, and this is really what the mechanics behind that. It allows you to build like a model, which is a very static thing, and actually attach, you know, behaviors that's triggered by modifications, if you like, to instances of that model. So you can bake in behavior right in the core, and it doesn't matter whether people are coming through share, FTP, or through a service, or even through mobile, that those behaviors will always run. So it gives the impression that your model has kind of, you know, smarts or implementation. Now one of the things that I'm going to talk about here, which is related to RM but is now in the core, are behavior annotations. So this is a kind of a bonus thing that you get to hear about today. Now this was originally developed in 2.2, and it was only in RM, and the reason that we did this is because we were having difficulties managing all our behaviors, okay, in RM. As you can imagine, there's a lot of smarts attached to that core RM model, and behaviors are a brilliant way to do it, but we needed to find a way of as I call it, not suffering death by behavior, where you've got you know, lots of different important things kind of everywhere, and you need to be able to have a simple way of kind of managing them and maintaining them. So annotations actually simplifies the code quite a lot, and it gives us a mechanism for actually maintaining this stuff simply. And it's so useful that it's actually now been merged down into 5. I think it's available in 5.0b. So you can use this stuff in your customizations outside of RM. So we'll talk about both of those as we go. So what we're going to do is add a behavior bean, and we're going to add that into the into our server-side customization. So this is just a bog standard POJO. Here's my compliance record metadata aspect. Now what I tend to do in order, again, this is best practice. 2 things. One, I will tend to have a class or a class per model construct. So I'll have a class per aspect or class per type, and in those 2 classes I'll collect the behavior that relates to that, because it's just it makes it much easier to manage. So what you end up is, if you've got a sort of behavior implemented model, you'll have, as well as having all your kind of XML definitions, you'll have a set of, you know, classes that relate to all those entities, right? So it becomes easier to figure out what's doing what. Now we're going to be interested in when this aspect is added. So again, good practice is to implement the policy interface that you want to implement, and that's where having one class per type helps, because you're only going to have one on-add aspect method for that aspect, right? So you're not going to have to deal with different names. So I can implement that, and therefore I get my on-add aspect name, on-add aspect method. Okay, so at the moment that's just a regular class. Now what we need to do is actually wire that up, register that to listen for the appropriate trigger out of the repository, and ultimately execute whatever code we put in here when stuff happens. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is use the behavior bean annotation to indicate that this is indeed a behavior bean. And this is primarily done for performance reasons, so that we can instantly pick out, when the application context loads up, which beans we have to kind of inspect and wire up to the right policy. Now there is one property on here which is default type, and again, if you use this kind of one class per construct, this is quite handy because it allows us to say for every behavior that we're going to add to this, by default it will relate to this particular aspect. So it kind of gives that one-to-one relationship. You don't need to add this, but 9 times out of 10 it's a very convenient way of doing it. So you can see we're relating it to our custom aspect as you'd expect. So the next thing we want to do is then indicate that this method is indeed a behavior, and we need to also indicate what policy we want to listen for. So we can use this behavior annotation. We have to tell it what kind of behavior it is, be it a class behavior or an association behavior. And in this case, it's a class behavior, which means that it's about what happens to a node as opposed to the linkages between nodes. And we also need to tell it how often or what frequency we want this thing to occur. Now, by default, it will happen every time. So, like inline, kind of you add the aspect and this code will run. And in some situations that's appropriate, but in most cases you actually want this behavior to run at the end, just before the transaction is committed, because that allows whatever code's running to actually manipulate all the objects, and then finally you kind of run your additional behavior and everything's in the correct state for that transaction. Okay, so in this case we're doing that at transaction commit. I'm just looking at, and so that there is enough information for the annotation stuff to kick in and actually wire this method up to that on-add aspect behavior. Now, those of you who have done this before using the policy component will know there's a couple of things missing here, and that's because these annotations actually make some assumptions for you. The first thing they do is that if you don't specify the name of the policy, they will assume that the name is the method name, okay? Which, if you implement the interface, is always true, okay? Which again, why it's good practice to implement the interface, and it's one less thing to worry about. You can, of course, specify it in here if for some reason you need a different method name, or you've got two on-add aspect kind of behaviors in the same class. It will also deal with, as we said, associative behaviors and allow you to specify the association type, which it will by default assume is CM contains, because 90% of the time that's true. You can specify this to be a service behavior for those of you that use those, and that behaves like an event and just get run every single time this happens, regardless of the type. But that's obviously, you've got to have a good reason to do that. And there is a mechanism for naming these things in here, which allows you to retrieve the behavior object, which you would traditionally have to have created, should you need to disable it programmatically. Okay, so there are other options there. It pretty much covers all of the stuff you can do manually, but to be honest, even in my experience with the stuff we do in RM, 9 times out of 10, this is pretty much all you need to do. So finally, we're gonna inject the node service into our bean, and then after all that effort, all I'm going to do is generate a GUID and set the property. All right, but obviously the important thing is getting to this point here. Right, because once you get to this point, you've got a slot and you can do whatever you want. Okay, you can go and access a third-party system, you can do whatever you like in Java. Okay, just FYI, a couple of good practice things as well, particularly when you're doing a transaction commit behavior, is to double check that it exists, because you could have triggered the event and then deleted the node later in the transaction. And it's also a good idea just to check that it's not pending delete as well. Just a couple of useful little tips there. So all of that done, the last thing I have to do is just register it with my application context, and you'll notice all I've got to do is inject the node service. Okay, I don't have to do anything else, and it's all ready to go. So that means then when I go back to my my demo, I can file my electronic record. Let's grab any old thing. See my originally named demo docs. I'm going to go and apply my record metadata as I did before. Here's my indicator. But now if we go and have a look at the metadata on there, you'll see that my compliance ID has already been automatically generated for me. Okay, and that kind of again takes that need away from the from the user. There it is in my edit view. Should I wish to, I could then just go and automatically complete that record because that mandatory data has been fulfilled for me. Okay, so that kind of gives you an example of how you can, hopefully that's, I know it's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but the idea of this is primarily to give you kind of like an entry-level kind of set of ideas that you can start to follow and give you access to this. All of this stuff is in the example customization project in the Alfresco SDK. It's all executable and runnable. We're going to try and maintain this because it's a useful kind of QA tool for us to make sure we don't break stuff going forward. Obviously there's the RM documentation. The RM team's myself and Tuna, who unfortunately isn't here today, otherwise I'd embarrass him and drag him up here. But just feel free to grab us if you've got any questions. I'm here for the next 2 days in the expert bar. Happy to talk about RM, futures, demos, whatever you want. Okay. Any questions? Or have I stunned you all into science this early in the morning?
Have you any plan on allowing to create several record management sites?
Yeah.
Is it possible now?
Yeah, so just in case people couldn't hear, the question was, do we plan to allow multiple records management sites? So the answer is yes, it's on the roadmap. The difficulty is that with some of the other features on the roadmap, to be perfectly honest, at the moment it's further down the list because there are more important things to tackle. But from my point of view, I'd love to do it because it's just something we just need to tick off. We're 50% of the way there. The thing that's holding us back just kind of doing it is that we need, the tricky bit is been partitioning the records management configuration by file plan, and that actually requires you to have a content model that is scoped only by a particular instance, if that makes sense. And we the repository doesn't quite allow us to do that out of the box, so we need to figure out a way that we can, work with the tools we've got. So definitely on the roadmap. At the moment you can kind of get around it because of the fine-grained security, so you can have a larger file plan and partition it off by kind of users, which isn't as ideal. Yeah, as soon as I would love to get it done, is the bottom line. We're just kind of trying to find the slot to do it. Any other questions? No? Okay, well if you think of anything, I'm around. Just come and grab me. Okay, and I will let you, I think we're 1 minute early, so I'll be in everybody's good books. Okay.